I want to return to the question about reading Durkheim differently, and say again, reiterate that what one does as a sociologist dealing with Durkheim in this way is one builds on Durkheim's strengths, but takes other parts of his thinking and reflects upon it and perhaps modifies it somewhat. And I want to give another example, and the example is Suicide, Durkheim's book Suicide. Now, very often people criticize this book for its methodological naivety, its the errors that it promulgates and so on. But one not untypical criticism of Durkheim comes from an American sociologist with a French name called Benoit Schmelian, who writing in the 1940s, argued that Durkheim was developed something which he called an agelic thesis about society. And roughly what he meant by agelic was the notion that that which actually causes things to happen and is the source of things happening in the world is never an individual, but it's always a group. So he accuses Durkheim of believing that groups or society as a whole are the source of activity, and that the particular individual human being is a total irrelevance. And he gives us an example of this, an interesting example, where Durkheim says roughly this, that when people commit some particular kinds of suicide, their own reasons for committing suicide, which they may convey with a suicide note, are actually merely occasions for the suicide. They're not the causes of the suicide. What causes the suicide is the condition of society and the person's relationship to it. Indeed, Durkheim does say this, but I want to just clarify what he's actually arguing here, because it's of great significance, I think. What he's actually arguing is that we do not necessarily understand our own moods. And when we are in particular kinds of situations and particular kind of conditions, we ascribe to our moods an explanation which is in line with how we think the world works, including ourselves. Therefore, if, for example, I'm very depressed and I can't really work it out, then I realize that, say, somebody has just died, I will think to myself, I'm depressed because they died. But it may not be because of that. It may be because of something else. Or if I'm feeling very depressed and I say to myself, it's because a girl jilted me again. Then again, it may not be that, but it may be something else. Now, of course, it may be that. You may have put your finger on the actual issue. But very often, we're not too self-conscious about our social relations and where we stand. So what Durkheim argues is that he develops a model of what might be considered to be a sort of equilibrium model of the human beings. That when we are under these particular circumstances, that we are relatively stable and relatively able to deal with the misfortunes that may come across us as a human being. So he would suggest, if you look through his work, that a certain level of self-interest and self-care is a good thing for people to have. An altruistic orientation is an essential thing for people to have. It's caring for others and caring about the way society is working. That you must have some sense of what is a viable form of life, a way of life which you, in fact, can find interesting to live, and which you can actually sustain. So, for example, you don't beat yourself up because you don't actually have a Mercedes-Benz car, but you're happy with the Volkswagen that you have in your garage. That you are not horrified to find you only have 3 children when you believe you should have 7. I mean, there must be some relationship between expectations and possibilities. And it sounds extremely conservative at first until you realize it's not necessarily so at all. I mean, if you're a revolutionary, for example, you can only do so many things in a day, and that's going to be true whoever you are. And so you may agitate so much a day and write so much and feel disappointed with yourself that you couldn't do more, but there becomes a limit. So it's a notion here of finding some way of regulating your own conduct using what you consider to be valid and reliable ways of judging your conduct, so that you can then work in an effective manner. Now, there are 2 things which might disrupt that for Durkheim. One is that you may actually have sets of rules which don't work very well for you. Another one is that you have sets of rules which you actually find unacceptable, imposed upon you. In the first case, you might say that you're most typically what Durkheim describes as a state of anomie, that you actually lack reference points, lack stability, there is a poor fit between your needs for some sort of order and the amount of order available. In the other case, it may be that what the problem for you, confronting you, is that you are experienced to a situation which creates what he calls it fatalism. This would be a situation where, for example, you are in prison or you are a slave and you have no control over what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, when you get rest, and so on. Durkheim sees this as an example of tyranny, where society becomes tyrannical. Now, Durkheim, so let's split now, go from this to the more radical takes here. We may not be aware of these things actually causing us the source of our distress, but they may well be. So Durkheim is saying that we need to not only look at what people know is something which is causing them distress, we also need to look at what may be making them vulnerable to distress. And these may be things which have to do with the situation of the person in relationship to their social world. Now, again, take the question of radicalism here. Now, Durkheim argues that, and I'm extrapolating for Durkheim here a little bit. But of course, it's a very anomalous for Durkheim in the late 19th century to imagine that the only people who in fact have a lack of control are prisoners and slaves. And he mentions some other cases, women who are childless when they wish to have a child, and young men who marry too young, Durkheim says. But the real comparison to draw is, are there forms of life which people are condemned to do things which they do not wish to do and do not in fact give them satisfactions? And many of the dispossessed in contemporary countries with fantastically high unemployment rates are clearly in that situation. So are prisoners in that situation. And if you have the US, where there are over 2 million people in jail, you could argue that the fatalistic condition is typical for many people. But also, going back to Durkheim's discussion of the forced division of labor, if we in fact are blocked from doing what we are perfectly capable of doing and would in fact make sense for us to do and for which we are well equipped, then there is a definite reason why we should feel that the social world is blocking our possibilities. So if we take the basic categories that Durkheim's using and rethink them in some kind of way, we find that we can become significant social critics. And the point about understanding something in a new way is that it provides us the possibility of thinking how things would be otherwise. So explanations are never redundant. Explanations always open up possibilities for us. And to give you another example, if you look at the early 20th century, say in Germany, and ask the question, what did Nazism mean? Most of the time, the answers are to do with overt forms of oppression. Obviously for Jewish people and for marginal groups like gypsies, for people who are defined as being mentally subnormal in some kind of way. For socialists and communists, the situation was anything but benevolent, and few would deny that there was oppression at work there. However, other people may have also had their lives structured in ways which limited their ability to become full human beings. And one of the important things about the Reich was it had a very stereotyped notion of heterosexual relations and familial relations. And so women were given a very specific role and celebrated in that role. But nevertheless, it was a very constraining gender role. People may not have realized that at the time, but we can realize that now. And so it's possible to conceive of ways in which Nazism was effective in controlling people when it was not necessarily described at the time as control. And this is an insight really which comes from the later period of the 20th and 21st century, when we've had the benefits of feminism and queer movements and so on, enabling us to see forms of oppression or forms of disadvantage which we were not aware of before. So again, let me stress then that a theorist like Durkheim, like other theorists, by their capacity to develop fertile theories and theories which are open to development, allow us to see the world in a much more complex way than we would have otherwise. Durkheim himself admired Descartes, and Descartes sought simplicity and sought for a minimum of elements when trying to understand complex situations. Durkheim certainly saw that, but he also said, but we must not forget that reality is complex, and sociology has to be complex to deal with the complexities of reality.